What is up, Jimsy Squad? Today we have a story that is pure villainy met with a legendary mic drop from beyond the grave. Imagine finding your dad drugging your dying grandfather at 3 a.m. just to forge a new will because he thinks you're just a teacher who doesn't need money. This is a masterclass in karma, and I promise you the payoff at the lawyer's office is absolute gold. Let's get into it. I'm Jason Morrison. I'm 34 years old, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, I discovered my father had tried to steal my dying grandfather's entire inheritance from me by drugging him. It all started with a phone call. The kind of call that doesn't just wake you up, it detonates your sleep, leaving a crater of dread where peace used to be. The screen of my phone cast a ghostly blue light in my dark bedroom. 3:17 a.m. The name on the screen was Margaret. My heart hammered against my ribs. Margaret was my grandfather's hospice nurse, a woman of profound calm and competence. For her to call at this hour could only mean one thing. I snatched the phone. "Margaret? Is he?" "Jason," she said, and her voice was stretched thin, tight with an unnatural urgency that I had never heard from her before. "Your grandfather is asking for you. He was just a moment ago. I think you should come now, as quickly as you can." The unspoken words hung in the air between us. "There isn't much time." "I'm on my way," I said, already out of bed, fumbling for my jeans in the dark. My mind was a chaotic slideshow of images of Grandpa Bill. Him teaching me how to ride a bike on the cracked pavement of his driveway. Him smelling of pipe tobacco and old books as he read to me from The Hobbit. Him, 2 years ago, sitting in a sterile doctor's office, absorbing the words pancreatic cancer, with a quiet dignity that broke my heart. For the past 2 years, that 40-minute drive to his old Victorian home had become a ritual, a pilgrimage. I was a high school English teacher. To my parents, that meant I was a disappointment, a man wasting his potential on a meager salary. But to Grandpa Bill, I was a success. He was my anchor, my staunchest defender, the only person in my family who understood that a life's value isn't tallied on a bank statement. The drive was a blur of empty streets and traffic lights blinking yellow into the void. Each mile marker felt like a tick of a clock counting down. I kept rehearsing my goodbye, the words I needed to say, the gratitude I needed to express for a lifetime of unwavering love. I wasn't ready. I would never be ready. When I turned onto his quiet, tree-lined street, a jarring sight shattered my grief-stricken haze. There, parked in his driveway, its silver paint job looking obscene under the gentle glow of the porch light, was my father's Mercedes. My dad, Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Real Estate Development. He hadn't bothered to visit in over a month. He was always closing a major deal in Boston, or in back-to-back meetings with investors. His presence here, in the dead of night, was more than just unexpected. Felt like a violation. Felt predatory. My key slid into the lock, the click sounding unnaturally loud in the dead of night silence. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The house felt wrong. Normally, there was a low hum, the oxygen machine, a classic movie playing on the television. Tonight, there was nothing. A heavy, suffocating stillness that felt colder than the air outside. The door to my grandfather's study, which had become his bedroom for the past few weeks, was ajar, spilling a thin sliver of light into the dark hallway. As I drew closer, the door swung open further and a woman I'd never seen before scurried out. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with a pinched, anxious face and eyes that darted around like frightened birds. She clutched a leather briefcase to her chest as if it contained state secrets and practically sprinted down the hall, her gaze fixed on the floor, refusing to acknowledge my existence as she slipped out the front door and vanished into the night. A heartbeat later, my father and his primary business associate, a sycophant named Victor Chambers, emerged from the study. My father was in the process of straightening his silk tie, his face set in a mask of grim satisfaction. He looked like a man who had just closed a particularly difficult deal. Victor, by contrast, looked pale and nauseous, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Jason," my father said, his voice booming with false surprise. He always spoke a little too loudly, as if to assert his dominance over the very air in a room. "What on earth are you doing here?" "Margaret called me," I said, my eyes scanning past him into the study. "She said he was asking for me." "Where is she?" He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture he'd perfected over a lifetime of brushing aside inconvenient details. "Ah, I gave her the night off, sent her on an errand. We were just taking care of some final family business for Dad. Tying up loose ends." Loose ends. The phrase sounded obscene. I pushed past him, my shoulder brushing his expensive suit, and that's when I saw it. The scene that will be forever seared into the back of my eyelids. My grandfather was lying in his hospital bed, his head lolled to one side, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. His face was slack, his eyes closed, but it was the details that screamed of desecration. On the bedside table, next to his water glass, sat a new, expensive-looking fountain pen, a brand I knew my father favored. And on the crisp white sheet, just inches from Grandpa's limp, age-spotted hand, was a small, dark smear of blue-black ink. A single, misplaced drop. My grandfather was a man of meticulous habits. A former architect. He never made messes. He never had shaky hands, not even in his illness. That single drop of ink was a shout in a silent room. It was evidence of a struggle, of a hand being forced, of an act of violation. "Richard, you absolute scumbag. You really thought a professional architect like Grandpa Bill would leave a messy ink smear? You're so blinded by greed that you became a sloppy criminal. Drugging your own father in his final moments? That's not just tying up loose ends. That's straight-up evil." The air in the room was thick with the scent of betrayal. I didn't know the exact mechanics of what had just happened, but a cold, sickening certainty washed over me. I hadn't just arrived for a final goodbye. I had stumbled onto the scene of a crime, and I had arrived just moments too late. That dark blue ink stain wasn't just a drop. It was the endpoint of a story my father had been writing my whole life. A story of ambition, resentment, and two completely different definitions of the word worth. To understand the poison of that moment, you have to understand the antidote that was my grandfather. Grandpa Bill was my sanctuary. His house was a fortress against my parents' world of relentless judgment and material obsession. I think back to one perfect autumn afternoon, a few years before the cancer had staked its claim. I was helping him in his library, a room my father had once unironically suggested they convert into a state-of-the-art home gym. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the sweet, comforting scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. We were sorting books, a task he performed with the reverence of a holy ritual. He pulled a worn, cloth-bound copy of To Kill a Mockingbird from the shelf. The spine was soft, the pages yellowed. He ran a hand over the cover. "Your father," he said, his voice a gentle, rumbling bass. "He looks at this and sees 100 pages of wasted time. Time that could be spent networking or analyzing market trends or whatever it is he does." He let out a dry chuckle. "He doesn't get it. He thinks strength is something you project, something you build in a gym or a boardroom." He handed the book to me. "But a story, Jason. A good story is a gym for the soul. It builds muscles you can't see. Empathy, integrity, courage. That's real strength. The kind that holds up when everything else falls apart. Never let anyone tell you that's not important." That afternoon, sitting among the silent, waiting stories, I told him about mine. I told him about my kids at Northwood High, in a district where the school board was always cutting budgets. Kids who were bright and funny and full of potential, but who were reading years below their grade level. Not because they weren't smart, but because life had been hard on them, and no one had ever taken the time to put the right book in their hands and tell them they mattered. As I spoke, I saw a fire kindle in my grandfather's tired eyes. It was the spark of a man who didn't just see problems, but saw solutions. "Well," he said, slapping his knee with a surprising force, "that won't do. That won't do at all. Let's do something about it." And just like that, the Morrison reading program was born. He didn't just write a check. He was involved. He came with me to a used bookstore and we spent hours picking out books he thought the kids would love. Adventures, mysteries, stories of underdogs. He funded the whole thing, from the books to the pizza we had at our weekly meetings. Before he got too sick, he would come and sit in the back of my classroom, a quiet, towering presence. The kids, who were often wary of adults, adored him. He never talked down to them. He asked them what they thought of the characters, what they would have done in their shoes. He was building their empathy muscles one book at a time. That was his idea of a good investment. That was the legacy my father was actively trying to erase. Now, contrast that memory with a family dinner a year before the diagnosis. It was my mother's birthday, held at my parents' house. Their home was a monument to my father's success. A sprawling, minimalist mansion of glass and steel that felt less like a home and more like an art gallery where the art had been chosen for its price tag. My mother, Caroline, spent most of the meal detailing the exorbitant cost of her new Italian marble countertops. They had to fly the slab in from Carrara. Jason, can you imagine? She'd said, as if I were incapable of grasping such extravagance. My father, sipping a wine that probably cost more than my weekly paycheck, decided it was time for our favorite family pastime, dissecting my life choices. I was talking to Bob Henderson the other day. He started a classic opening. His son, you remember Mark? The one who went to law school. He just made partner at his firm. 33 years old. Driving a Porsche. He's handling the legal side of a massive new commercial development downtown. He paused, letting the comparison hang in the air. So, Jason, how's teaching going? Still shaping young minds? The sarcasm was a physical thing, a sour taste in the air. It's good, Dad, I said, focusing on cutting my overcooked piece of salmon. We just finished The Great Gatsby. Ah yes, a story about a self-made man destroyed by his obsessions. My father said with a smirk. You should pay attention to that one. My mother chimed in then, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. Darling, we just worry. Your father works so hard to maintain this family's reputation, to build a real legacy. A teacher's salary. It's a noble profession, of course, but it's not substantial. What about your future? Pension? You can't live in that tiny apartment forever. I'm happy, I said, the words feeling thin and defensive. My father let out a short, sharp laugh. Happiness doesn't fund a retirement, Jason. It doesn't secure your place in the world. Your grandfather filled your head with all that sentimental nonsense about finding joy in your work. Joy doesn't get you a seat at the table. Joy doesn't get you a seat at the table? Man, this dad is a piece of work. He looks at a high school English teacher and sees a failure because there's no Porsche in the driveway. He has no clue that Jason is building muscles for the soul, while Richard is just building a house of cards on gambling debts. The irony is about to hit him like a freight train. I looked from my father's dismissive face to my mother's anxious, perfectly made-up one. In that moment, I had never felt more alone. I was an outsider at my own family's table, speaking a language of purpose and passion that they simply refused to understand. Their world was built on a foundation of money and status, and my choice to build my life on something else was an insult they couldn't forgive. This dynamic became painfully clear as Grandpa got sicker. My days were filled with the quiet, intimate realities of his decline. I learned the precise timing of his medications, the subtle shift in his breathing that signaled pain, the way his eyes would light up for a moment when I read a particularly thrilling chapter from an Agatha Christie novel. I was there for the bed baths, the doctor's visits, the long, silent nights. Margaret, his nurse, and I formed a silent team. She was a godsend, a woman whose gruff exterior hid a well of compassion. He waits for you, you know, she told me one afternoon, as we adjusted his pillows. His whole day is structured around your visit. You're his anchor. My father's visits were fleeting and performative. He'd stride in, already talking on his Bluetooth headset, give Grandpa a hearty, too loud, "Hey, Dad, looking good." Spend 5 minutes talking at him about stock prices or zoning permits, then kiss him on the forehead and leave. He never stayed long enough for the silence to settle in. He never stayed long enough to really see the man in the bed. I'll never forget the last time I saw them in the same room together, before that final, terrible night. My father had stopped by, looking flustered. He'd just lost out on a major contract. "The whole system is rigged, Dad," he'd complained, pacing at the foot of the bed. "I had the inside track, but some competitor came in and undercut me. It's all about who you know. I need more capital to play at that level. A significant cash injection to show them I'm serious." Grandpa, who had been quiet, opened his eyes. He looked straight at my father. "Is that all you think about, Richard? Money?" My father stopped pacing. "It's what makes the world go round, Dad. A fact you seem to have forgotten." "No," Grandpa whispered, his voice raspy but firm. "People do. Love does. Integrity does. Money is just a tool. It can be used to build or it can be used as a weapon." He coughed, a racking, painful sound. "Be careful which one you choose, son." My father just scoffed and changed the subject. Now, standing in that desecrated room, looking at the evidence of my father's choice, I knew. He had chosen the weapon. My hand went to the bedside table, to the bottle of liquid morphine. I knew that bottle. I knew the dosage. 2 milliliters every 4 hours. I picked up the small oral syringe next to it. It was a 10 milliliters syringe. The plunger was pushed down to the 7 milliliters mark. At least 5, maybe 6 milliliters had been given. A massive, dangerous overdose. Enough to render a frail man completely senseless, unable to protest, unable to do anything but lie there as his own son guided his hand to sign away his entire legacy. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. "Just got back. Richard sent me on a wild goose chase for a special kind of bottled water he said your grandpa needed. The pharmacy he sent me to had never even heard of it. I feel like something is terribly wrong. Is everything okay?" The pieces clicked into place. He'd gotten her out of the way. It was all premeditated. I turned to my father, who was still hovering in the doorway, that arrogant, self-satisfied look back on his face. I held up the syringe. "You call this tying up loose ends?" I asked, my voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. "You call this helping?" The smugness finally vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted anger. The real Richard Morrison. "Don't you dare take that tone with me. You, with your pathetic little charity project and your second-hand car. I am securing this family's future. I am protecting the Morrison legacy from being squandered on book reports and pizza parties. Something you, in your little fairy tale world, would never understand. But I did understand. I understood perfectly. He wasn't protecting a legacy. He was robbing a grave. And he had just handed me all the proof I needed. The moment those words left my father's mouth, the fog of shock and grief burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. This was no longer just a family drama. This was a crime scene. "Get out," I said again, my voice no longer shaking, but dangerously low. "Get out of his house. Now." My father let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You have no right to order me around, Jason. This is my father's. And you just poisoned him." I roared, the sound ripping from my throat, raw and ragged. I took a step towards him, holding the syringe like a weapon. "Margaret!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the unnaturally silent house. "Call 911. Now!" I heard her frantic footsteps, and then she was in the doorway, her phone already pressed to her ear. Her eyes, wide with professional horror, darted from the syringe in my hand to my grandfather's slack face, to my father's suddenly panicked expression. The CO mask was gone, replaced by the face of a common criminal caught in the act. "It was a mistake," he stammered, backing away. "I misread the dosage. He was in so much pain. I was just trying to help. He was sleeping peacefully when I left an hour ago." Margaret's voice was sharp, cutting through his lies. "I have his pain levels charted. He didn't need anything." She turned her attention back to the phone. Yes. I need an ambulance and a police officer at 112 Elm Street. Possible intentional overdose. The patient is William Morrison. The son, Richard Morrison, is on the scene. The mention of the police sent a visible jolt through my father. He grabbed Victor Chambers, who had been frozen in the hallway like a deer in headlights. "We're leaving," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "But the documents—" "The notary," Victor stammered, his face clammy with sweat. He looked like he was about to vomit. "We have the signature." My father snarled, his eyes dark with menace. "That's all that matters. Let's go." He was no longer a grieving son or a powerful CEO. He was a cornered animal, interested only in escape. He practically shoved Victor towards the door. As they scrambled past me, Victor's terrified eyes met mine for a fleeting second. He opened his mouth, a silent plea for absolution, and a single desperate whisper escaped his lips. "I didn't know about the morphine. I swear to God." And then they were gone, the front door slamming shut behind them, leaving a vortex of silence and the sickeningly sweet smell of my father's cologne. The next few hours were a nightmarish blur of flashing lights, paramedics, and the calm, measured questions of a police officer. Dr. Patel, my grandfather's hospice physician, arrived, his face a grim mask. They worked quickly, stabilizing Grandpa, but the damage was done. The overdose on his already compromised system. "It's a profound shock," Dr. Patel told me in the hallway, his hand on my shoulder. "Jason, I'm so sorry. At this stage, it's about managing his comfort. We can't reverse this." He never woke up. For 6 agonizing days, he lingered, a ghost in a hospital bed, tethered to the living world by the steady beep of a heart monitor. The family descended, each bringing their own brand of grief and dysfunction. My Aunt Patricia, my father's younger sister, was a whirlwind of righteous fury. She flew in from Seattle, her artist's clothes a splash of defiant color in the sterile white hospital. She'd been estranged from Richard for years, and now I finally understood why. She found me in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a styrofoam cup of coffee that tasted like burnt plastic. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "The bastard finally did it, didn't he?" she said, sliding into the booth. "He finally monetized his own father's death." I told her everything, the 3 a.m. visit, the missing nurse, the syringe, the stolen documents. She listened, her jaw getting tighter and tighter until I thought it might crack. "He's been working on this for months, Jason," she said, her voice laced with contempt. "Calling Dad constantly, telling him the business was in trouble, that he needed to consolidate the family trust. He kept saying that leaving a significant portion of the inheritance directly to you was fiscally irresponsible and bad estate planning. Dad told him where to shove his estate planning. Bill knew exactly who Richard was. He just hoped he was wrong. My cousin Emma, Patricia's daughter, provided the missing piece of the puzzle. She was a medical resident at the hospital and had a network of friends in all sorts of professions. She pulled me into an empty supply closet during one of her rounds, her face etched with worry. "Jason, be careful," she whispered, looking over her shoulder. "I called a friend of mine who's a financial analyst. She has contacts." She made some calls. Emma took a deep breath. "Uncle Richard is in serious trouble. He's leveraged to the hilt. But that's not the worst of it. He has massive gambling debts to loan sharks in Atlantic City. We're not talking about a credit card maxed out. We're talking about the kind of debt that gets people hurt. He's desperate." The ugly picture was finally complete. This wasn't just a cold, calculated act of greed. This was the frantic, panicked act of a drowning man, willing to pull anyone under with him, even his own father, to get one last gasp of air. Grandpa Bill died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was rising. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray. I was holding his hand, which had grown so cold. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor that had been the soundtrack to my life for 6 days simply stopped. The silence it left behind was the loudest sound I had ever heard. My father, naturally, took charge of the funeral. It was his final and perhaps greatest performance. He played the role of the bereaved son with an Oscar-worthy conviction. He chose the most opulent mahogany casket, filled the church with towering arrangements of white lilies that made the air cloying and heavy, and stood at the door, accepting condolences with a perfectly calibrated expression of solemn grief. His eulogy was a masterpiece of fiction. He spoke of my grandfather as a titan of industry, a ruthless negotiator, a builder of empires. He told anecdotes about my grandfather's business triumphs, stories that painted him as a man made of steel and ambition. He was describing himself. He never once mentioned my grandfather's kindness, his generosity, the reading program, or the countless lives he had touched with his quiet compassion. In the back pews, a small contingent of my students sat with their parents. They hadn't known the titan of industry. They had known Grandpa Bill, the kind old man who listened to their stories and told them they were smart. They sat in silent, dignified tribute to the real man we were mourning, an island of truth in an ocean of my father's lies. Their presence was my anchor. After the service, as my father was holding court with a circle of his business associates, my ex-girlfriend, Sophia, found me. We'd broken up years ago, but a quiet, respectful friendship had eventually bloomed from the wreckage. She was a prosecutor with the DA's office now, and she had a mind that could cut through nonsense like a scalpel. "I'm so sorry, Jason," she said, her voice warm with genuine sympathy. She gave my arm a comforting squeeze. "Your grandpa was one of the good ones." I just nodded. A lump of grief lodged in my throat. Her gaze drifted over to my father, and her expression sharpened, the prosecutor taking over. "I've been hearing some things," she said, her voice low. "Whispers about the will. That your father filed a new one. A very new one. The night he was overdosed," I said, the words tasting like ash. Sophia's eyes narrowed into slits. "Okay, that's not just a whisper. That's a klaxon horn. A will executed under those circumstances, by a beneficiary who directly administered a suspicious dose of medication. That's not just legally questionable, Jason. That's an open invitation for a criminal investigation. Filing a fraudulent will is a felony. And that's before we even get to the elder abuse charges." Her words were like a splash of cold water. She wasn't just offering sympathy. She was offering a weapon, a path forward. 2 days later, the official declaration of war arrived. A crisp, cream-colored envelope with the letterhead of a slick, downtown law firm I'd never heard of. It was a formal notice that the last will and testament of William P. Morrison had been filed with the probate court. It named Richard Morrison as the sole executor and beneficiary of the entire estate. My name appeared only once, in a single cruel line that I knew my father had probably written himself. "To my beloved grandson, Jason, for whom I wish all the best, I leave my love and encouragement." Love and encouragement? Seriously, Richard? You stole millions and left your son a pat on the head in a fake document? That is a special level of petty. You didn't just steal the money. You tried to weaponize Grandpa's voice to insult Jason one last time. I can't wait to see this ironclad will get incinerated. He hadn't just stolen the inheritance. He had weaponized my grandfather's love, twisting it into a final, dismissive pat on the head. Reading that line, the grief in my heart hardened into steel. This was not over. He had stolen my grandfather's assets. He had stolen his voice, but I would not let him steal the truth. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for George Harris, the one man my father, in his arrogance, had likely forgotten. My grandfather's lawyer. My grandfather's friend. My last hope. The 2 weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. My father, armed with his newly filed will, moved with the swift, predatory confidence of a shark that knows its prey is bleeding. He acted as though the entire matter was settled. He called my Uncle Robert on the West Coast to discuss restructuring the family trust and liquidating underperforming assets to create more liquidity for new ventures. He was already spending the money. He and my mother even had the audacity to invite Aunt Patricia over for dinner, a transparent and clumsy attempt to manage the family optics. My aunt told me about it on the phone later, her voice seething. He slid a check across the table to me, Jason, for $10,000. He called it a sentimental token from Dad's estate. He expected me to be grateful, to shut up and go away. What did you do? I asked. I slid it right back, she said. I told him he could take his token and his fake grief and shove it. I don't think Caroline will be inviting me back for dessert anytime soon. While my father was playing the role of the benevolent new patriarch, I was preparing for war. My first meeting with George Harris was in his office, a sanctuary of order and quiet dignity that felt like a world away from my father's loud, boastful existence. The office smelled of old books and lemon polish, exactly like Grandpa Bill's study. George was a man in his late 70s, but his eyes were clear and sharp, missing nothing. He had been my grandfather's lawyer for 45 years. More than that, he had been his confidant, his chess partner, his friend. I sat in a worn leather chair opposite his massive oak desk and laid out the entire sordid story. The 3 a.m. call, the fleeing notary with the terrified eyes, Victor Chambers' desperate, whispered apology, the syringe, the new will filed by a lawyer I'd never heard of. I talked for 20 minutes straight, the words tumbling out in a torrent of grief and rage. George listened without interruption. He didn't take notes. He just watched me, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression calm and unreadable. When I finally ran out of words, the silence in the room was heavy. George, I pleaded, the desperation raw in my voice. Please tell me we can fight this. Please tell me he can't get away with it. He let out a long, slow breath. Jason, your father has a signed document. It's witnessed, it's notarized. His lawyers, and he will have the best, will paint a picture of a dying man who had a final moment of clarity and decided to consolidate his business legacy in the hands of his experienced son. They will portray you as a disappointed grandson, lashing out because you were cut from the inheritance you felt entitled to. In court, it often comes down to who tells the more believable story. The sliver of hope I'd been clinging to began to dissolve. So that's it? He wins. George leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw a glint of steel in his eyes. I didn't say that, he said, his voice dropping. I said they will tell a story. Our job is to tell the truth. And the truth has a weight to it that lies don't. He stood and walked to a tall filing cabinet against the wall. I knew Bill Morrison for most of my life. He was cautious. He was meticulous. He was 10 steps ahead of everyone, especially Richard. He did not leave things to chance. Ever. He paused, his hand on the cabinet drawer. Let your father think he's won. Let him get comfortable. Overconfidence is a fatal flaw. Let me do some digging. Don't talk to your father. Don't talk to your mother. Just be patient. Patience felt like an impossible request, but I trusted him. I left his office feeling like I had at least one person in my corner. But I couldn't just sit and wait. I felt a desperate need to do something. That night, I was rummaging through a box of my grandfather's things I'd brought back from his house. A few old sweaters that still smelled like him, a stack of mystery novels, a framed photo of him and my grandmother on their wedding day. At the very bottom of the box, I found a small, black leather-bound moleskine notebook. I'd never seen it before. I opened it. Most of the pages were blank. But on the very first page, written in my grandfather's elegant architectural script, was a short, undated entry. It was cryptic, a riddle. It said, "A man's real worth isn't in what he owns. It's in what he creates and who he protects. A father's journals are not for sale. They are for the son who knows how to listen. Find Mrs. Patterson." My heart stopped. Mrs. Patterson, the nervous notary. He had left me a message. A clue from beyond the grave. It was the first tangible piece of evidence that I wasn't going crazy, that my grandfather knew something was amiss. Suddenly, I wasn't a victim waiting for a lawyer to save me. I had a mission. I had instructions. Finding her was surprisingly easy. A quick online search for Notary Public, Brenda Patterson, in my grandfather's zip code brought up one result. a small office in a nondescript strip mall about 15 minutes from his house. The next afternoon, I drove there, my stomach churning. What was my plan? Confront her? Plead with her? I had no idea. I was operating on pure instinct, guided by that single cryptic line in a notebook. Her office was a tiny, cluttered space that smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. She was at her desk stamping a document. When she looked up and saw me standing in her doorway, the color drained from her face. Her hand froze mid-stamp. She knew exactly who I was. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper. I decided to channel my grandfather, not my father. No intimidation, just quiet truth. "My name is Jason Morrison. My grandfather was William Morrison. You were at his house a few weeks ago." She immediately became very busy, shuffling a stack of papers that didn't need shuffling. "I handle many estate signings. I don't recall every client." "I think you recall this one," I said gently. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Mrs. Patterson. My grandfather was a man of integrity. He taught me that the choices we make when we think no one is watching are the ones that truly define our character." Her shuffling stopped. Her head was still bent, but I could see her shoulders trembling. "I know my father," I continued, taking a small step into the room. "I know he can be persuasive. He puts people in impossible positions." I paused. "My grandfather wrote your name down in a notebook, Mrs. Patterson. He wanted me to find you. I don't know why, but I think he trusted that you were a good person." She finally looked up at me, and her eyes were swimming with unshed tears, a look of profound, cornered despair. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My son. He'll ruin my son." Before I could ask what she meant, a thought struck me. I remembered my ex-girlfriend, Sophia. I called her later that day. "Sophia, I have a hypothetical legal question for you," I said. "This is about your dad, isn't it?" She sighed. "Hypothetically," I repeated. "If someone wanted to coerce a professional, say a notary, what kind of leverage would be most effective?" "Something that isn't public knowledge," she answered instantly. "Something that could cause a lot of personal or professional damage if it came out. A sealed juvenile record. A recent DUI that hasn't hit the courts yet. Something that makes the threat of exposure more terrifying than the risk of committing a crime." That was it. That had to be it. But how could I find out? My answer came from the most unexpected source. 2 days later, I got a call from a blocked number. "Meet me at the Starbucks on a main street in half an hour. Come alone." It was Victor Chambers. My heart pounded. Was it a trap? I told Aunt Patricia where I was going, just in case. I found him in a back booth, hunched over a coffee cup. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Thank you for coming," he mumbled. I can't live with this." He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "This is the name of Brenda Patterson's son, and his case number. Your father had a private investigator dig up his sealed juvenile record. A stupid joyriding charge from when he was 16. Richard was going to use it to get him expelled from his university's education program. The kid wants to be a teacher." The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. My father, who despised my profession, was using the threat of destroying a future teacher's career to steal my inheritance. "He's terrifying her, Jason," Victor whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "He calls her every day, reminds her what's at stake. She's going to lie for him at the will reading. You have to do something." "Why are you telling me this, Victor?" "Because your grandfather was a good man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He invested in one of my early businesses when no one else would. He gave me my start. I owe him, and I can't be a part of what Richard is doing." I left that Starbucks with a new resolve. I now knew the battlefield and the weapons being used. My father was using fear. I had to use something stronger. The day before the will reading, I went back to Mrs. Patterson's office. I didn't mention her son. I didn't mention Victor. I just put a small, framed photo on her desk. It was a picture of my grandfather sitting in my classroom, surrounded by smiling students. "This is who he was," I said quietly. "This is the legacy my father is trying to destroy. Your son wants to be a teacher. He wants to do this, to make a difference. That's a noble thing. My grandfather would have thought so. Whatever you decide to do tomorrow, I just wanted you to remember the kind of man he truly was." I left the photo on her desk and walked away. I had done all I could. The rest was up to her. The eye of the storm had passed. The hurricane was about to make landfall. The conference room at George Harris's law firm was designed to be intimidating. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of its occupants like a dark mirror. The air was cold, recycled, and thick with tension. I sat at one end, feeling like a lone defendant at his own trial. At the far end, my father held court. He was flanked by my mother, who wore an expression of pained, stoic nobility, and his lawyer, Diane Winters. Diane was a woman who looked like she gargled with nails for breakfast. She radiated an expensive, reptilian competence. My father looked utterly relaxed, leaning back in his chair, the picture of a man in complete control. My Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert sat along the side wall, their faces tense. They were spectators at a family execution. And in a chair near the door, positioned for a quick escape, sat Brenda Patterson. She was a coiled spring of anxiety, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. She stared at a fixed point on the carpet, refusing to look at anyone, especially not at my father. George Harris walked in, his deliberate, unhurried pace a stark contrast to the frantic energy in the room. He placed his worn leather briefcase on the table with a soft thud that sounded like a gavel. "We are gathered today," George began, his voice filling the room, "to address the matter of the last will and testament of my late client and friend, William P. Morrison." He looked around the table, his gaze lingering for a moment on my father. "However, before we proceed to the contents of any document, there are some significant irregularities surrounding the filing that must be addressed." Diane Winters leaned forward, a predatory smile on her lips. "Mr. Harris, with all due respect, this meeting is a formality. My client, the deceased son and executor, has filed a legally binding and properly executed will with the probate court. It is signed by the testator, witnessed by Mr. Victor Chambers, and notarized by Mrs. Brenda Patterson. It is, by all legal definitions, ironclad." George gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Indeed, a will was filed. He opened his briefcase and removed a single sheet of paper. A will executed at approximately 2:45 a.m. on June 15th, a week before Mr. Morrison's passing. He let that fact settle into the room. A time when, according to hospital and hospice records, Mr. Morrison was under the influence of a significant, unscheduled dose of narcotic pain medication. A dose administered by his loving son to ease his terrible pain, Diane countered smoothly. "My client will testify that his father, in a brief and poignant moment of lucidity, insisted on making these final changes to secure his business legacy. A moment of lucidity that no one from his medical team can corroborate," George stated flatly. He pulled out another folder. "In fact, I have here a sworn affidavit from his primary hospice nurse, Margaret Riley, detailing a dangerous deviation from the prescribed medication schedule. I also have a formal report from his physician, Dr. David Patel, which concludes that the dosage in question would have rendered Mr. Morrison medically incapable of understanding, let alone legally executing, a complex legal document." I saw a flicker of doubt in my Uncle Robert's eyes. My father's confident smirk tightened at the edges. "Doctors can be mistaken. Nurses can be overly dramatic," Diane retorted, waving a dismissive hand. "What you have is speculation. What we have is a signature." "A signature is not a blank check for fraud," George said, his voice hardening. He then turned his gaze from Diane and looked directly at the terrified woman by the door. His voice softened, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. "The law takes the coercion of a sworn officer of the court, like a notary public, very seriously. "Mrs. Brenda Patterson, could you please tell us about the events of that night?" This was the moment. The air crackled. Every eye in the room swiveled to the small, trembling woman. My father stared at her, his eyes cold and hard as granite. It was a silent, brutal command. "Remember your son. Remember what I can do." Brenda Patterson flinched as if struck. She looked at my father's face, then her eyes darted around the room and landed, for a brief second, on me. I tried to project nothing but the quiet encouragement I'd offered in her office. "Remember who he was." She took a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to pull all the oxygen out of the room. And then she stood up. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it sliced through the silence like a razor. "Yes, Brenda. Talk about a profile in courage. Richard tried to ruin a future teacher's life just to blackmail his own teacher son. The irony is delicious, watching Richard's face crumple into a mask of disbelief, while his own witness turns on him. Chef's kiss. "He made me do it," she began, tears starting to well in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison, Richard, he found out about my son." She was speaking to George, but her words were for everyone. "My boy, he got into some trouble when he was 16. A stupid joyriding incident. His record was sealed. He's in college now, studying to be a special education teacher. He's a good boy. He's my whole life." She took another breath, her voice gaining strength from the truth. "Richard had someone dig it up. He told me that if I didn't do exactly what he said, he would send a copy of that police report to the dean of my son's university. He said he'd hire a team of lawyers to make sure my son was expelled and never got his teaching license. He said he would ruin him." My mother gasped, putting a hand to her mouth. Aunt Patricia just shook her head, her face a mask of disgust. "He called me that night and told me to come to the house," Brenda continued, now openly weeping. "He said Mr. Morrison was having a moment of clarity and wanted to make a small change. But when I got there, that poor man, he wasn't clear at all. He was barely conscious. He couldn't even hold the pen properly." Her voice broke. Richard held his hand. He wrapped his father's fingers around the pen and he guided his hand to make the signature. I just stood there. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. Diane Winters shot to her feet. "Objection. This is a fabrication. This woman is clearly unstable. She's been coerced by the other side." "Sit down, Ms. Winters," George said, his voice like ice. "She is under oath." He looked at Brenda with immense kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Took great courage to say that. You have honored my friend's memory." He then turned back to my father, whose face had crumpled into a mask of disbelief and rage. "But your lawyer was right about one thing, Richard. Your father did have a moment of perfect clarity. It just happened 5 months ago." George reached into his briefcase and produced a thick, blue-backed document. Felt like he was pulling a sword from a stone. "This is the true last will and testament of William P. Morrison, executed in this very office, on a day he was assessed and certified as being of sound mind and body by Dr. Patel. Witnessed by myself and my associate. It is, to use your lawyer's term, ironclad." George put on his reading glasses. He detailed a few small bequests. Then he got to the heart of it. "To my son, Richard Morrison, a man whose ambition has so often blinded him to his own humanity, I leave the sum of $5,000. It is my sincere hope that he will one day learn that the most valuable things in a man's life are the ones that cannot be bought or sold." My father made a choked, gagging sound. George's voice rose with authority. "All the remainder of my estate, including my primary residence at 112 Elm Street, the entirety of my investment portfolio, and all personal effects, I leave to my beloved grandson, Jason Morrison, whose integrity and compassion have been the great pride of my life." He looked up at me over his glasses. "Furthermore, I direct my executor, George Harris, to establish the Morrison Educational Trust with an initial endowment of $1.2 million. This trust is to be managed by Jason Morrison for the sole purpose of supporting underfunded school libraries and continuing the community literacy program that he and I started together. I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't about the money. It was the words. His integrity and compassion have been the great pride of my life. He had seen me. He had always seen me. And one final item, George said, turning to the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall. He left a video message to ensure there was no ambiguity about his final wishes. He pressed a button. The screen flickered to life, and there he was, my grandfather. Thinner, yes. Frail, yes. But his eyes were on fire with a fierce, unwavering clarity. He was looking right at the camera, as if looking right at my father. "Richard," he began, his voice raspy but strong. "If you are seeing this, it means my greatest fear has come to pass. It means that in my final days you chose greed over love. You chose deception over dignity. Son, I know about the gambling debts. I know about the loan sharks. I know how desperate you are. I have been watching you turn into a stranger for years." He paused, and his gaze seemed to shift, to find me in the room. "Jason, my boy, the house is yours now. Fill it with what you love. Fill it with books. Fill it with the laughter of those students. The work you are doing, that is our family's real legacy. Never forget that. It has created more value in this world than any real estate development ever could." He turned back to face my father one last time, his expression softening into one of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "And Richard, despite everything, I forgive you. But forgiveness is not a license to continue your self-destruction. Forgiveness does not mean enabling your worst impulses. Get help, son. Before you lose something more precious than money. Before you lose your soul." The screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute, a perfect vacuum. Then, with a horrible guttural groan, my father pitched forward from his chair, his head hitting the mahogany table with a sickening thud before he slid to the floor in a boneless heap. As my mother shrieked his name, Sophia, my ex-girlfriend, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room the entire time, stood up. She walked calmly to the front, her prosecutor's composure absolute. She looked down at my father's crumpled form. "Filing a fraudulent will is a felony," she said, her voice clear and cold as ice. "Financial elder abuse carries a mandatory prison sentence in this state. I suggest you get him a criminal lawyer." Immediately, the storm had not just broken. It had unleashed a tidal wave, and my father was drowning in the wreckage of his own making. The immediate aftermath was pure pandemonium. My mother was hysterical, kneeling on the expensive rug beside my father's unconscious form. Diane Winters, the high-powered lawyer, looked completely poleaxed, her entire case, her entire strategy, incinerated before her eyes. Uncle Robert rushed to my father's side, trying to loosen his tie, his face a canvas of confusion and dawning horror. In the midst of the chaos, Victor Chambers, the man who had been my father's silent accomplice, finally broke his silence. He stood up, his whole body trembling, and addressed George Harris, though his gaze was fixed on me. "He promised me a cut," Victor said, his voice thick with shame and relief. 10%. Said it was a finder's fee for a new investor. I'm in a lot of financial trouble. He knew that. He said all I had to do was witness a signature, and if it ever came up, to just say that Mr. Morrison seemed fine. Just tired. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I swear on my children's lives, I didn't know about the morphine. I saw him give his father something, but he said it was just his scheduled pain medication. I never would have been a part of that. Never." His spontaneous confession, corroborating Brenda Patterson's testimony, was the final, unassailable brick in the wall of evidence against my father. There was no way out for him now. As my mother and uncle managed to get my father conscious and slumped into a chair, Sophia made her move. She was no longer just a spectator. She was an officer of the court witnessing the confession of multiple felonies. She walked to the head of the table, her presence commanding the room. "Richard Morrison," she said, her voice devoid of any personal history we shared. "Now pure, professional steel. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly advise you to exercise that right." "Ms. Winters," she said, turning to the stunned lawyer, "your client is now the subject of a criminal investigation. I trust you know what to do." The threat was no longer implied. It was a formal declaration. The game of probate court was over. The far more serious game of criminal justice had begun. The weeks that followed were a grueling marathon of legal procedures and fractured family dynamics. My father, stripped of his power and bravado, seemed to shrink before my eyes. The titan of industry was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old man facing the very real possibility of spending his remaining years in a prison cell. He hired a top-tier criminal defense team, and their first and only strategy was to negotiate a plea bargain. This was when my mother launched her final offensive against me. She called me day and night. Her tactics shifted from pleading to guilt-tripping to outright emotional blackmail. "Jason, how can you do this to your own father?" she'd cry into the phone. "He's a sick man. He was desperate. This will kill him. He's sick because of the choices he made, Mom." I'd reply, my voice tired but firm. "Think of the family name, the scandal, all your father's hard work, his entire life, dragged through the mud. You have to tell the district attorney to show mercy. It's the Christian thing to do." The Christian thing to do would have been not to drug his own father to steal an inheritance. I shot back, my patience finally snapping. "You were there, Mom. You knew. You stood by and let it happen." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. I was supporting my husband," she stammered. "No," I said, and the words felt like they were coming from a place of strength I never knew I possessed. "You were enabling a criminal. You chose a lifestyle over a person. I am not going to interfere with the legal process. Dad needs to be held accountable for his actions. It's the only way he'll ever change." I hung up, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel a shred of guilt for disappointing her. I had finally extricated myself from her web of toxic loyalty. I had chosen my grandfather's values over her demands. The plea deal, when it came, was harsh, but it kept him out of prison. Sophia explained that his age and lack of a prior record were mitigating factors, as was his willingness to plead guilty to the most serious charges. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony financial elder abuse and 1 count of attempting to file a fraudulent document with the court. The sentence was a public humiliation and a financial execution. 5 years of intensive probation. He was assigned an ankle monitor for the first year. He was legally mandated to attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times a week and undergo intensive individual therapy. He was ordered to pay full financial restitution to the estate for all legal fees incurred, a sum that wiped out nearly every penny he had left. He had to perform 2,000 hours of community service. And, perhaps the biggest blow to his ego, he was forced to surrender his CEO title, his seat on multiple corporate boards, and his real estate and brokerage licenses permanently. He was forbidden from ever acting in a fiduciary capacity again. He was, for all intents and purposes, professionally and financially annihilated. My Uncle Robert, a quiet, decent man who had been horrified by his brother's actions, was appointed by the board to take over as CEO of Morrison Real Estate Development. His first act was to issue a public statement apologizing for the previous leadership's ethical failings and pledging a new era of transparency and integrity. The last time I saw my father during that period was when I went to my parents' house to collect a few boxes of my old things. The house was already on the market, an echo chamber of its former grandeur. Most of the ostentatious furniture was gone, replaced by little white tags from an estate sale company. I found him alone in the cavernous living room, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the manicured lawn he would no longer own. He looked 20 years older, his expensive suit replaced by a simple polo shirt and slacks. He looked small. He turned as I entered the room. "Jason." His voice was a hoarse whisper. "Dad." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence thick with unspoken words, with years of resentment and misunderstanding. "I'm sorry," he finally managed to say, the words catching in his throat. He couldn't look me in the eye. He just stared at a spot on the floor. For all of it, I didn't have a grand speech prepared. I didn't have words of either condemnation or forgiveness. I just had the truth. "I know," I said. He finally looked up, his eyes glassy. "Your grandfather, he was twice the man I am." "Yes," I said quietly. "He was." There was no hug. There was no cinematic reconciliation. It was just a quiet, painful, and necessary acknowledgement of a truth he had spent his entire life running from. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As I walked out of that house, leaving the keys on the counter, I didn't feel the thrill of victory or the satisfaction of revenge. I just felt a profound, quiet sense of peace. The hurricane had passed. The ground was clear. It was time to start building. The next year was a year of reconstruction, both literally and figuratively. The grand Victorian house on Elm Street, a place that had held so many conflicting memories of love and neglect, needed a new soul. It needed to breathe again. My first call was to the most unlikely of contractors, Victor Chambers. After his testimony, Victor had become a pariah in the real estate community. He'd lost his job, his reputation, and, he told me, his self-respect. He called me a few weeks after the sentencing, his voice hesitant. "Jason, I know I have no right to ask you for anything," he'd said, "but I need to do something to atone. Not just for the courts, but for myself. I'm a pretty decent carpenter. I used to do it in college. Let me help you with the house. No pay. Just let me do something good. Please." I heard the genuine remorse in his voice. I thought of my grandfather who had believed in second chances. "Okay, Victor," I said. "Be here Monday morning at 8. Our first act of transformation was to take a sledgehammer to the wall separating the stuffy, formal living room from the equally stuffy formal dining room. Knocking down that wall felt symbolic, like we were breaking down the barriers of my family's past. We spent months turning that cavernous space into a warm, sun-drenched haven. We built floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, just like the ones in my grandfather's study. We painted the walls a cheerful buttery yellow. We filled the space with mismatched, comfortable armchairs we found at thrift stores, and sturdy tables for kids to do their homework. The grand opening of the William Morrison Community Library and Reading Center was 6 months later. It wasn't the quiet, hallowed hall my mother would have designed. It was gloriously, wonderfully loud. It was filled with the cacophony of life. Kids from my reading program were sprawled on colorful beanbag chairs, arguing about whether Harry Potter could beat Percy Jackson in a fight. A group of senior citizens, who I later learned called themselves the Mystery Mavens, were having a heated debate about an Agatha Christie novel in a corner. My cousin Emma, who had just finished her residency, had volunteered to run a free Health and Wellness Wednesday for seniors in the room that used to be my grandfather's study. The house that had been so silent in its final days with him was now bursting with conversation, laughter, and learning. Felt like his spirit was in every corner, smiling. The Morrison Educational Trust was also making a real, tangible difference. It felt like we were planting seeds from my grandfather's legacy all over the state. In that first year alone, we provided grants for new technology, smartboards and laptops, to 15 different underfunded school districts. We fully funded the creation of 3 brand new school libraries in rural areas where kids had never had access to one before. On the small brass plaque we installed at the entrance of each library, beneath the words, "Generously donated by the Morrison Educational Trust," I had a second line engraved, "Wealth measured in wisdom." My father's journey was much quieter. I'd get occasional updates from Aunt Patricia. He was sticking with his GA meetings. He was serving his community service hours without complaint. He had found a modest job as a property manager for a small firm that owned a few low-rise apartment buildings. It was humbling work. He had to deal with leaking faucets and tenant complaints. It was a universe away from his old life of billion-dollar deals and corporate jets. One afternoon, I was driving home from school when I saw him. He was part of a work crew in bright orange vests, cleaning up trash from the median of a busy highway. Our eyes met for a moment through the rush of traffic. He looked tired, weathered, but there was a stillness in his face I'd never seen before. The restless, hungry ambition was gone. He gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. I nodded back. It was a strange, silent communication. He was paying his debt to society. He was doing the work. My mother, unable to cope with the loss of her social standing and the dramatic downsizing of her lifestyle, had divorced him. Aunt Patricia told me she'd moved to a condo in Florida to live with her sister, where she could complain about the injustice of it all to a new audience. She never called me. The silence was a relief. About a year after the will reading, I was finally tackling the final frontier. The attic. It was a dusty time capsule of forgotten family history. In a far corner, under a heavy canvas tarp, I found a large, cedar-lined chest. It wasn't locked. I lifted the heavy lid, and the scent of cedar and old paper filled the air. My breath caught in my throat. The chest was filled with leather-bound journals. Dozens of them, stacked neatly, tied with twine, spanning over 60 years. It was my grandfather's entire life, chronicled in his own precise, elegant handwriting. His journey from a dirt-poor farm boy in Nebraska to a successful architect and developer. His thoughts on business ethics, his courtship of my grandmother, his joy at my father's birth, his quiet disappointment in the man his son became. It was his real story, the one my father had never cared enough to listen to. On top of the very first journal was a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside wasn't a long letter, but a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key, the kind for a safe deposit box. Beneath it was a short, handwritten note on his personal stationery. Jason, it read, if you are reading this, it means you have found my most valuable possession. Not the house, not the stocks, but my story. This key opens safe deposit box 412 at the First National Bank downtown. Your name has been on the account for years. What you will find inside is not more wealth, but more truth. It is the rest of the story, the parts one couldn't always say out loud. Consider it your true inheritance. Tucked behind the note was a yellowed newspaper clipping, an interview with my grandfather from a business journal published in the 1980s. I'd never seen it before. The final question from the reporter was, Mr. Morrison, you've built an incredible real estate empire. What do you consider your single greatest achievement? I expected his answer to be about some landmark building or a record-breaking deal. But he had answered differently, and he had underlined his response in red ink so that I couldn't miss it. His answer was, my greatest achievement is knowing that I have raised a son who understands that time is more valuable than money, because time is the only currency you can only spend once. I sat there on the dusty floor of the attic, the key heavy in my palm, and I wept, not with sadness, but with a profound, overwhelming sense of love and understanding. All those years I felt like a disappointment, all those times my parents made me feel small for my choices. He hadn't been talking about my father in that interview. He had been talking about me. He had always seen me. He had always known. The journals were his history, the house was his gift, but the key was his final, ultimate act of trust. It's been 5 years since the day my father collapsed in that conference room. 5 years since my life was irrevocably altered. The William Morrison Community Library is no longer just a library. It's the beating heart of the neighborhood. The reading program I started with Grandpa has become a district-wide model, and I now spend half my time training other teachers on how to implement it. Life is full. It's meaningful. It's good. I never became the CEO my father wanted me to be. I still drive a sensible second-hand car. My teacher's salary is still modest. But I am, by any measure that truly matters, a very wealthy man. I am rich in purpose, rich in community, rich in the knowledge that I am living a life that honors the man who mattered most to me. On my desk at school, next to a chipped mug filled with pens, I keep the expensive fountain pen my father used that night. It's a strange memento, I know. It's empty of ink, but it serves as a powerful, daily reminder. A reminder that the most valuable things in life, trust, integrity, love, can never be forged or stolen. They have to be earned, cultivated, and protected. It reminds me that our circumstances don't define our character. Our choices do, especially the choices we make when we are tested. My father and I have found a quiet, fragile peace. We speak on the phone every few weeks. The conversations are often awkward, skirting the edges of the vast, painful chasm of our past. But they are honest. He finished his probation. He still attends his GA meetings. He still works his quiet, unassuming job as a property manager. He seems to have, at last, found a measure of contentment in a simple, accountable life. I don't know if our relationship will ever be fully healed, but we are no longer at war. He is, finally, just my dad, a flawed man trying to make amends in the twilight of his life. A few months ago, a moment happened that brought everything full circle. I was in the library helping a young girl find a book on constellations. Across the room, I saw one of our most dedicated high school volunteers sitting with a new student, a shy 7-year-old boy who was struggling to sound out a difficult word. The volunteer was patient, kind, and incredibly encouraging. He leaned in and whispered something to the boy, which made the boy smile and try the word again, this time successfully. The volunteer was Brenda Patterson's son. He's a sophomore at the State University now, at the top of his class in the special education program. He volunteers at the library 3 afternoons a week. He looked up and saw me watching him, and he gave me a warm, genuine smile. In that simple, quiet moment, I saw the beautiful, powerful ripple effect of a single choice. The choice to fight for what was right. The choice to lead with empathy instead of anger. The choice to believe in the goodness of others. A young man's future had been saved, and he, in turn, was now dedicating his future to helping others. My grandfather's legacy wasn't just in the books on the shelves or the money in the trust. It was here in the living, breathing connections between people. The journals my grandfather left are my Bible. I've read them all and I reread them often. They are a roadmap for a life of purpose. On the very last page of his final journal, he had written one last thought, a sentence that has become the compass for my own life. He wrote, "Richard wanted the money. Jason wanted the time. In the end, they both got exactly what they valued most. Wealth measured in wisdom." That line gives me chills. Grandpa Bill was playing 4D chess while Richard was stuck in the casino mud. Richard ended up in an orange vest cleaning trash on the highway. Talk about a reality check. And Jason, he became the wealthiest man in the room without owning a single CEO title. He was absolutely right. And as I look around at the life I've built, a life rich with time spent well, I know with every fiber of my being that I am the luckiest man in the world. I wouldn't trade a single second of it for all the money my father ever dreamed of. Wow, Jimsy Squad, what a journey. This story proves that integrity isn't just a fancy word. It's a foundation that can withstand even the worst betrayal. Richard lost his company, his social standing, and his wife, all because he couldn't see the value of a single good story. And shout out to Grandpa Bill for being the ultimate mentor and protecting his legacy from beyond the grave. I love that the notary's son is now a sophomore in special education volunteering at Jason's library. Talk about a beautiful full circle. What do you guys think? Was the plea deal too soft on Richard? Or is cleaning trash on the 101 the perfect punishment for a failed mogul? Let me know in the comments. If you loved this satisfying takedown of a greedy CEO, smash that like button and subscribe for more Reddit drama. Thanks for hanging out with Jimsy, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe,